So, Stygian Onslaught, how are we liking this new Genshin Endgame? Between the mixed reactions, the notion that Hoyo may be running out of ideas when it comes to the types of endgame that they can add into Genshin, the community fighting one another because one side think that it's fine that SO is basically free 450 gems, while the other side think that Hoyo shouldn't have made the higher levels catered to only people who has achieved way lord level status in the game. To me, both sides have merits to think what they think, but first let's talk about the game mode itself. It kinda suffers from the same issue that had been plaguing Genshin for quite some time, and really I'm sure some people have already had quite enough with this being a reoccurring flaw in any new Genshin content. Stygian Onslaught, good concept, but the execution to some people didn't really quite hit the mark. They wanted to give the players another source of primogems through the easy part of the endgame, while also providing a segment of the game mode that can be used by people who wants to absolutely challenge themselves by going against bosses with mechanics that can only be screwed by certain teams or elemental combinations. For someone like me who quite frankly cannot give two craps about challenging myself in this game, having another source of easy 450 gems is just about enough for me to play the mode, get the primos, and move along. Screw anything above difficulty 4, and quite frankly, if you only look at it from a primogem perspective, there really is no reason to be upset over the rewards locked behind difficulty 4, 5, and 6, since there's no primos to be had there. However, Hoyo's sort of mistake is underestimating just how much people still want the rewards that are locked behind these impossible difficulties, even if they aren't primos to begin with. Feathers is a very understandable complaint. Fearless difficulty is already quite a doozy to do, especially with the current boss arrangement where you need very specific mechanics to even have a chance at fully clearing the level. I think it wouldn't be amiss to expect that Feathers should really stay as a reward within the first 4 much more manageable difficulties, since it is something that really should be accessible to most, if not all players. Weapon cosmetics on the other hand, well, that's a reward that is much more debatable in terms of whether it really should be that accessible. Cause, I get it. They wanted to give these skins to the people who can actually clear the Omega Dual DPS check that is dire difficulty, and of course, there are actually some whales or players out there who wants these skins to be difficult to get as a way to give them some sort of, bragging rights, cause I don't know, it's just a pride thing? It does make sense because usually when other gacha devs want to give some sort of reward for players who have done like some insanely investment heavy endgame stuff that really isn't realistic for most players to do, they would usually resort to giving those players cosmetics that refresh once certain seasons of something ends. And of course, it being cosmetics that doesn't actually affect the playability of anything in the game, it really shouldn't matter if people have them or not. Plus, you lose them every time the game mode refreshes anyway, so it can either serve as a motivation for you to continuously try to maintain getting them, or use it as justification to yourself to not even bother trying to get it in the first place. Unfortunately, the other problem that comes out from this is that the skins actually look pretty ballin'. Admittedly, even I almost let the creeping thoughts of expending the effort to try and get the 4-star versions get to me, but I quickly realized that the mode just isn't for me and I just let it go. But for certain other people, especially for those who apparently have wanted to have those types of cosmetics to be included in the game, they felt like it's a pain to see a feature that they wanted to have in the game for so long, only for it to be virtually impossible for 99% of the player base to even hope to achieve. Honestly, I think Stygian Onslaught would have far less complaints had the rewards been shifted just a teeny tiny bit. Because I'm a big fan of the whole, but the main rewards, which will always be primogems in the easiest section, since not only would it be easy for the old players to get, but newer players can have a decent chance at actually completing those levels even with mid-game builds. But for the skins and the feathers, I would want to shift them down to the first 5 difficulties. Feathers should always be something easily accessible because everyone needs it, and we already get very little of them to begin with, especially if you are a player who do not buy battle passes, which would be a good amount of the player base. Now, the 4-star skin should be a reward that we can get from difficulty 5, because even light spenders to dolphin folks would struggle on that difficulty, so having the skins in exchange for not getting primos should be a fair trade. The 5-star skins are where things get a little bit tricky for me to give suggestions to. At first, I just straight up thought, why don't we shift the 4-star skins to be part of the rewards for difficulty 4, and therefore 5-star skins can be part of the rewards for difficulty 5, and it would match up pretty nicely, to the levels and all that. But then you may ask, what about the rewards for dire difficulty? Since there are no 5-star skins to be had, what really is the point of doing dire difficulty? Well, let me run by you a quick little theory here, because to the logical mind, the perception of what Stygian Onslaught's dire difficulty is supposed to actually serve as is not really as a realistic endgame section that everyone would be able to complete. Dire difficulty is supposed to just be something that the top percenters of Genshin players are able to complete, whether skill-wise or spending-wise. And really, it's all in order to, well, be proud and have a sense of achievement by toppling an insanely difficult mode of the game. Whether it is just purely for their own self-esteem, quenching their thirst to complete the game, or just their way of having fun in this game, it really doesn't matter. Hoyo was trying to cater to all spectrums of the player base by making this endgame, and I commend them for it. However, locking rewards that everyone in the player base, regardless of their spending status or where they are in the game, would sorely need behind those elite achievements is really not the way to do it. Let's be very real here. The whales who complete these modes care very little about what they actually get in the game via winning these challenges. If Hoyo truly wants to create a dire difficulty that caters to those extreme whales, then what the rewards are kind of really shouldn't matter, so long as it is able to signify their achievements and tell others, hey, look at this thing. It shows that I completed that mode. And to give you guys a perspective of this, look, there are people out there who would target getting insanely high platinum medals in those types of combat events, and for what reason? To get more rewards? Nope, they get nothing out of it. The medals stop changing once you reach a certain points threshold, and the primo rewards ends even further before that. These people, the people that dire difficulty was supposedly made for, did it for their own sense of satisfaction. The fact that they now get cosmetic rewards for it is really going to just be a small little bonus compared to the feeling they would have from being able to complete the run and post their run somewhere on the internet with a title of like, I don't know, dire difficulty 60 seconds clear or something like that. It's really just about the message that having those things would send to others. So if I were to give a suggestion, maybe give them a couple of 5-star artifact boxes and then give them a special name card for completing the dire challenge. Maybe a unique one that has like a cool animated graphic or effects or whatever, because one, if they display it in their profile, then it should be enough for people to recognize that these are players who have done dire difficulty. 2, it's a cosmetic that isn't as coveted by players compared to weapon skins, and 3, it really should be something that regular players should not mind missing out on. Because, goddamn guys, if you are still going to complain over missing out on a goddamn name card, then you just have an insane issue with FOMO. There's only so much a game can do to avoid triggering your weak-ass anxieties. Now, the other half of the complaint regarding these rewards is that players actually don't mind and understand why certain rewards are locked behind those insane difficulties. However, the issue is more with how they are locked behind those insane difficulties. Because, quite frankly, the major flaw that we have seen from most Hoyo games is the inflate HP, give it a timer, and call it a day tactic in terms of making endgame only look difficult when in reality you just don't have enough time to do the level because you have to burn through an insane amount of damage squash that people who do not have C6 R5 of stuff will just simply never be able to comfortably break through. And again, it all has to do with execution. Inflating HP is nothing new when it comes to making more difficult endgame. Countless other games have gone through this route, but the glaring difference between how those other games do it with how Genshin does it is that Genshin does not provide the players with a way to actively scale their own characters, buffs, and mechanics that would then create an accessible route for players to use in order to handle those increased HP and aggression. Like, let's take for example Borderlands 2. Your character level progression actually stops at level 80 if you were to have all the proper DLCs, but then after level 80, you can unlock a mode that is called Ultimate Vault Hunter mode, which then gives you the chance to unlock overpowered levels. Basically, this OP level lets you fight enemies whose levels will be raised according to how many OP levels you are playing with. The max amount of OP level you can add to your playthrough is 10, which would mean that you guys will be fighting level 90 enemies while you are still at level 80, which is similar to how Genshin puts you on dire difficulty, while your builds don't really have any changes or buffs implemented on them. But with Borderlands, you can then get drops which scales with the OP level that you are playing with. So while your characters may be stuck at level 80, the weapons you will be getting and using will have increased stats based on the OP level in which it dropped in, making it so that your weapon damage can at least scale with the new challenges that you are going for. Genshin just doesn't have this kind of feature implanted in Stygian Onslaught. Sure, they have the Exalted Ones buff, but realistically, 20% buffs won't do crap when you're going against bosses that feels like they have way more of an increase than just 20% HP. There is no change of mechanic numbers, buffs, or anything that would provide any type of scaling that we can use to then better tackle those higher difficulties. Not to mention, the buff is restricted to a select cast of characters that many players may not have access to. In comparison, Borderlands OP level buffs apply to all the gear that drops in your playthrough, which means that whatever playstyle or gear that you were centering your build around, bar a few melee builds, they should all equally buff up in accordance to how far you are going into the OP level challenges. And even with that kind of structure with the OP levels, there are still players who just didn't outright enjoy OP levels because it simply made going through the game feel like much more of a time sink due to how long it takes to kill certain bosses or enemies. And what really gets to me is that Genshin has the one tool they need to make this sort of scaling mechanic be a present element in their endgames. And of course, I'm talking about elemental reactions. I've seen many people lament at the fact that, oh, Genshin doesn't have dodge or some sort of actual parry mechanics, or oh, they don't have combo switch mechanics that games such as Zenless and WoWA has, which could be the way for them to get more mechanics into these boss fights. But to that, I say, no, they don't need that type of shit in Genshin. The reason I love to play Genshin's combat is precisely because of elemental reactions. It's a much more refreshing take on how you would want to do combat rather than your usual punch or slash or nuke someone with a magic spell type of combat you'd see from Rogue or Souls-like games. It's different, it's unique, and it's more of my speed. The problem currently in the endgames is that being able to properly use elemental reactions just does not feel rewarding enough, especially in later stages of Genshin endgames. And that's a major flaw considering the fact that elemental reactions is the backbone of this game's combat. And the main reason why it just doesn't outright feel rewarding enough is because of the one thing that games like Borderlands, Souls-like, or any other games that utilize endgame HP inflation doesn't generally have, which is a timer. I get the existence of a timer in this game. It forces you to actually try and find your team's maximum efficiency and best rotation cycles, all while doing the things necessary to incapacitate and beat the boss. But you know how sucky it feels to have gone through doing all the necessary elemental reactions, let's say for example, applying pyro to the lava boss when doing so means that you're losing out on consistent damage since that guy has insane pyro res, filling up that pyro bar, hoping for good damage, only for it to basically tickle the guy when you only get 2 chances to make him go through that process. Not because he can't get stunned or builds massive immunity to it after you do it twice, no, but all because you'd run out of time before you'd get to stun it for a 3rd time. That's why I think for something like the dire difficulty, the timer should just be removed altogether. Make the boss hit insanely harder, which it already does, but make it do it more often because that way, dodging, iframing, or just having a more effective sustain rotation will have much more value and make it so that if you're able to handle the boss mechanics, such as the Hydro Tulpa with its little bastard minions that you have to break, make it so that it feels much more rewarding to actually trigger those elemental mechanics needed to debuff the guy. Make it do more damage, make it so that their stunned or weakened state actually scale in how much they get debuffed based on the difficulty that you are in, instead of whatever piddly debuff it is that they are getting right now. Because realistically, you'd already be losing out on so much damage efficiency just purely based on the amount of HP you need to burn through in the same amount of time required to do so in the previous difficulties, making it so that being able to break the bosses be more rewarding would make fighting it feel nowhere near as crap as it is now. Now, the issue that I see rapscallions raise with making this kind of change is that, oh, that means you can just turtle up and take as much time as you want to kill the boss then. Where's the challenge? But I think people need to understand that there's a big difference between turtling and taking cheap shots at the boss in the periods where you know you can attack it without having any consequences, with having to actually survive getting one-shotted, while also making sure that you consistently proc their break mechanics whenever you have the chance. A lot of the problems in other games when it comes to turtling, let's say with games like For Honor, is actually because of how much more rewarding it is to parry in those games, which makes turtling seems like a cheap move and boring way to win. You just wait for your opponent to move, and more often than not, you'd get a decent upper hand if you're not crap at turtling. Guess what? Genshin doesn't have a parry mechanic, and if bosses have sufficient increase in aggression and difficulty in break mechanics, then having to turtle is not a problem you'd run into, since it will generally be a poor strat to even try an attempt. Unless of course, you're using some sort of press E and sit there type of theme, like a Farina Nahida Yae Zhongli combo. Which is why I think if SO can provide the initiative for the devs to make those more rewarding elemental breaks with the bosses hitting ridiculously harder, maybe not one shot on everything like 3-shot a squishy character or something like that, it will make a nice improvement to how the latter stages of Genshin's endgame should feel like, or at the very least to how SO should end up feeling like. Of course, it's not all easy. They still have to think about the balance so that players still need to do consistent damage outside of merely relying on those elemental breaks. Because if there's one complaint about SO that I fully disagree with, is when people complain that SO is merely an investment check. Not necessarily about the spending money on the game type of thing, but more about how people need to achieve very good builds to have a chance at completing difficulty 5 and above. And for that, I say, well no shit, it's the endgame. Do you really want the difficult stages of an endgame to be clearable with subpar gear and team builds? That's just kinda not the point. The endgame is not meant to baby you the entire way. If you weren't willing to at least spend the time to get good builds beforehand, then that is entirely on you. You can comfortably clear difficulty 4 on an alright build, and I know this because that's exactly the type of builds that I have on my own characters. I've always been easily satisfied with my stats, and while difficulty 4 needed a bit of a lock-in, it was still a relative breeze since there was enough time to go through the HP pool with builds that did not change from the hard difficulty. If people who had only been playing this game for a couple of months have difficulties clearing menacing, then that is totally understandable. But if people who have been actively playing this game for years and still struggle to get builds to clear menacing, then they might want to review how they've been building their characters or what team they are using. The real weakness that SO really cannot run away from is the fact that the bosses that they are putting in these levels will always be restricted due to the need for it to have some specific elemental break mechanic. Because this creates problems on two sides. One on the dev side is that the devs will always have to rely on only using bosses with those unique elemental breaks, because not all world bosses have that kind of feature for us to think about. And the second problem from the player base's side is that the fact that they are using those type of bosses also means that if you don't have certain characters who has the required unique buff mechanics such as Nilou with Bloom, the Natlan 5 stars with Night Soul, and more recently Skirk with the freeze buffs, you will probably have a harder time facing these bosses by default. Like, so far, I'm able to easily do the Overseer boss in difficulty 5 since I have Skirk with the premium combo of Escoffier, Farina, and Citlali. But I've yet to even wanna go for the others since I don't have Kanich nor Emily for the Lava Prick, and the Tulpa is just a pain in the ass to begin with. Normally, those two issues wouldn't be much of a problem, but the overall weakness with how Genshin had been developed over the recent years is that while yes, they are releasing a cool amount of new unique elemental combos or mechanics that we can now utilize and experiment with, Skirk and Emily being good standouts, they just straight up do not give us viable alternatives to go to if we do not have those specific ones. Most importantly, 4-star alternatives. And these bosses, at least in this first instance of SO, were practically made to promote those certain characters. And well yeah, sure, that's fair game and all that, but it doesn't change the fact that when they put these bosses into these sorts of endgame levels, well, no crap are there going to be a lot of people who are going to have less of a chance just because they don't have a certain character. It's ironic really, the devs just couldn't keep up with their own mechanic developments and are therefore really short in characters that could feasibly make use of those mechanics. There are 9 more 5-star characters than there are 4-star characters currently in the game. While this does seem to be a growing gacha problem instead of just Genshin's, it does go to show that you really feel it more in Genshin due to all the little specific parts of an elemental reaction that one character can be buffing that no other character can do. And that's really why, just like the case that I had with Imaginarium Theater, I love the concept that those two endgames have. But the whole party restriction thing and the fact that certain buffs only apply to certain characters is really a factor that makes me cringe every time I see it. No matter if I do end up enjoying those particular endgames anyways, it's the same reason why I actually hated the fact that they decided to now put leyline disorders on floor 12. I always like that they leave it blank because that makes it so that all we need to really think about is the enemies that we're facing instead of trying to work around making a team that could utilize those buffs to maximize our team. When we might have wanted to use or had a vision for a different team that unfortunately wasn't assisted by those buffs. Because let's not be naive here, the existence of these buffs gives the devs a justification to either put a bit more HP inflation into the level because the devs will think that people can take advantage of the buffs and therefore handle the buffed enemies, or put enemies in those chambers that can only really be effectively put down by characters who can take advantage of those buffs to begin with. Once again, completely restricting who you get to use in the first place. And with the growing lack of alternatives to those characters that can take advantage of the buffs, it just exacerbates the issue even further. Thankfully, the Abyss is kind of like the intro to Genshin Endgame, so even now, bar the exception of a few ridiculous damage sponge floor 12s in the past, it is still a relatively doable endgame. But I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who was once an Abyss Dolphin in this game. The Abyss should be difficult to do, but it shouldn't outright be because you don't have certain characters. This issue isn't as bad as some people would put it, but it is undoubtedly something that has been growing in presence over the past few years. There's just too much process of elimination to do when it comes to who you can use in specific situations. Back then, it was simply a matter of fighting certain elements with its weaknesses. Now you have to think about which specific elemental reaction you need to prioritize. You have to think about Night Soul. You have to think about whether your unique elemental reaction would be strong enough, which again would not be problems if we had the choices and alternatives to go along with it. That's why for something like Imaginarium Theater, I kinda just didn't get why the character restrictions are a thing. Realistically, the only team restriction that we'd have to face are the ones that are dependent on which enemies we are facing. Why not just let us be able to use 24 or 26 or however many characters it is that Imaginarium needs from the entirety of our roster instead of it literally being limited from the few elements the cycle always rotates around? And then just give us an option to pick a select amount of reaction buff types and then have the run play around those buffs that we have selected. Or hell, maybe instead of restricting the elements of our characters, just cycle what type of buffs are in the pool of certain rotations, but we are still free to put any character we want into that rotation's roster. Basically like a more controlled version of Simulated and Divergent Universe or Hollow Zero that Star Rail and Zenless has. Star Rail actually has that very rotational buff mode available via Divergent Universe called the Cyclical Extrapolation, where the buff you'd get by default will be catered to a certain playstyle, but the choice of which playstyle and characters you want to play and how you want to make use of that buff in that run is completely up to you. Coincidentally, Zenless also has Deadly Assault, which is basically their version of Stygian Onslaught. Instead of just putting us up against 3 bosses with certain characters getting buffs, they put up 3 different bosses, all of which we can face with any characters we want, while also having the option to utilize one of 3 major buffs available for that rotation. Essentially, if I were to equate it to Genshin mechanics, there's one buff that pretty much revolves around team rotation, there's one that buffs ultimate energy regen and damage, and there is one that basically buffs up Zenless' version of Elemental Mastery, all of which you can take advantage through a wide array of characters, so long as they encompass any of those playstyles. Of course, that being said, Zenless is much newer, so your choices may seem restricted anyway, but it's more due to the lack of time that has passed for characters to be released. And after selecting your team and the respective buffs you want to use, you then have to accumulate points that is combined through the damage you deal to the boss, while also activating the bonus point mechanic that is unique to specific bosses, which also revolves around the 3 playstyles that is in the rotation. And the reward structure is also similar to Stygian. There are 3 different points threshold that you can achieve, with the first 2 being the ones that gives you gems, and are also the ones that you can easily achieve so long as you actually have a build going in your squad, not be crap in the game, and are able to actively proc the bonus point mechanics. While the last threshold is really only for those who wants to be able to do more, and gives rewards that you don't exactly outright need, but probably wouldn't mind having in the first place. It's also part of the growing frustration because we know that Hoyo can make good versions of those type of endgames as proven from their other games. I just don't really get why Genshin seems to always get the short end of the stick. And mind you, out of the 3 main Hoyoverse games, despite being the oldest one, Genshin is still the only one that doesn't have that one weekly game mode that is supposed to be your extra source of gems, while also having the option to be extended as an endgame. And no, don't even try it. The paramedic transformer does not count. In any case, all those things I mentioned before is why, to me, Stygian Onslaught, while having a decent concept, was really not the kind of endgame that a lot of people really needed at this current time. But on the other hand, I get it. It's just like what this one Redditor said. The dev wanted to give something to the whales for them to go nuts in. Because at the end of the day, people like me have to realize that without those whales or people regularly spending money on this game, then we wouldn't be able to play this game for free. And I'm all for it. But at the very least, don't take resources that are already really hard to come by in the game, that is needed by everyone, and lock them behind the levels that realistically is a bit more suited for dolphins and whales to do. Skins, I don't really care. At the end of the day, it isn't something that affects our gameplay in any shape or form. It would be nice to at least have the 4-star versions be available in a lower difficulty, but I don't think that it's something that we should really be concerned about missing out on. They've made a great first step by keeping it so that primos are in the ultra easy levels, which really should be the end of the discussion, but since we had a lot of buzz around people being unsatisfied with the rest of the execution, I like to think that talking about it in this sort of video should at least help us discuss what they can really do to improve on it. Cause I do believe that there is a better way to blur the lines between making things accessible while also giving something fun and borderline torturous, so that the big spenders of the game can challenge themselves with it just so that they have a feel of what their money has bought them in the game. That being said, I want to be clear, just because people bought things in this game doesn't mean that they can just go ooga booga in dire difficulty. When I see someone actually clear dire difficulty in a total time of 60 seconds, you bet your bottom dollar that those chumps know what they're doing. If you think having C6 and R5 of everything automatically makes someone crap at the game or makes things a breeze, you might be in for a surprise. No amount of money can go against the sheer stopping power of being an idiot. Like I said in the beginning, if I want to be totally honest with you guys, I can barely give 2 fucks about the rest of the game mode. Give me my 450 gems and maybe that 1 feather and I'll quietly move on with my daily session of respectfully staring at Skirk for the next month or 2. That's it for the video. As usual, I hope you guys can take a thing or 2 away from this video, and thank you as always for making it this far. Until the next video, the name's Leafy, and I'll see y'all next time. Sayonara.